It's a pleasure to invite Ken and to turn the podium over to him and tell him that we're all friends here. So Ken, thank you and welcome.
Hard to know what to say after an introduction like that, but I think I'd start off with that old Woody Allen joke, and especially in terms of you're embarking on your doctorate, that 80% of success is just showing up. And so I'm glad you showed up today. So, and I think it's hard to know, or hard to give a talk on sort of motivation and interest in research, because to me it's a very personal thing. It involves very personal issues and issues of identity. So what I'm going to do is discuss how or what got me into research, why I did a PhD, and how to try and stay interested. Because in the last variable, I think this is the most important. It's staying connected and staying interested in your PhD. And I think there's a lot of variables. First of all, I believe that all research is personal. I think you have to find something that personally attracts you in your research, that you have to have a passion for it, you have to have an interest in it, you have to have a focus, you have to have a sense of humor. Because if you don't have a sense of humor about what you're doing and the research that you're interested in, it's going to be very, very difficult. At the end of my PhD, I was, stressed out. It seemed like a chore, but I had to find some sort of motivation to carry on doing it. I had to persevere in that way. And PhD, as my ex-wife said, meant permanent head damage. And I said, well, I know, I said, because you gave it to me over the last 3 years. Then she became my ex-wife, so that was okay. So I think there'll be days when you always think this is a chore, many days when you think, what am I doing here? What's the meaning of life? And on those days, you just have to remember why it is you started on this journey, why it is you started to do this, and believe in yourself in that sense. Now, I know it all sounds very cliched, but these are important. So, first of all, how I got started? Well, I believe that all research involves a personal. That can mean your background, can mean your upbringing, the things that affect you in life, the environment that you're socialized into to some extent. And one of the big things, I would say that a lot of my research comes from those things on the PowerPoint slide. All research is personal. There's a variety of places that can come from. Childhood experiences, your past, your peers, where you grew up, socialization, etc. And I grew up in a place called Glasgow, Scotland. City of Culture, 1990. It took a long time, but in 1990 they decided to make it City of Culture. It was not a very highly cultured city before then, but it became the City of Culture in 1990. And I grew up in a city where there was a problem with something called sectarianism, which means a sort of conflict between two kinds of religious divide in that sense, between the Protestants and the Catholics. There was a fierce rivalry between the two football teams, the Glasgow Rangers, who were mainly supported by Protestants, and the Glasgow Celtic, who were mainly supported by Catholics. And I grew up in I say a Protestant household, but my parents weren't very religious. They were nominally Protestant. And in Glasgow, the schools are divided into Catholic schools and Protestant schools, you see? And Protestants are not allowed to go to the Catholic schools, but Catholics can actually go to the Protestant schools, although there's very, very few intermingling in that sense, at least when I grew up back in the 60s and the 70s. So I grew up in a city that was riven with a kind of sectarian strife, and that affected me very, very much, because my father would take me to something called the Orange Walk every year. Now, he did take me to the Orange Walk. The Orange Walk was basically a Protestant march to celebrate the Battle of the Boyne in 1690. And this shows how long the conflict's been going on. He didn't take me there to say, these people are great, these people are fantastic. He took me there so that he could explain the history of it and say, look at these guys, they're a bunch of bigots. You know, they're sectarian bigots, and they want to cause religious, political, social strife, and they don't want to develop a sense of community. So there was violence on either side of that. What I'm going to do is, and Glasgow in that sense was a microcosm of the Northern Ireland problem. I'm going to show you a couple of clips which should start very shortly. No. Forward. Forward or backward.
Greetings, fellow Irishmen and lady Irishmen. I, Joseph Fitzgerald O'Malley Fitzpatrick O'Donnell, the Edge Quimby, welcome you to Springfield's first booze-free St. Patrick's Day. Oh, come on, people. Your drunken shenanigans destroy this town every year. And Ireland is so much more than the imbibing of spirits. The Irish gave the world the paddy wagon, the shamrock shake, and folk dancing where you don't move your arms.
Oh, where's the IRA when you need them?
We renounce the ways of the gun and the bomb. Oh, in the old days we would have been all over that.
Two kinds of Irish people? What are they fighting over? Who gets to sleep in the bathtub?
Actually, those Prots and Cathys have hated each other for centuries.
It always comes down to transubstantiation versus consubstantiation.
Stop
it, both of you! You have a common land, a literature, and the sweetest songs on earth. Tura lura lura, tura lura lie. Hush, my little baby, hush now, don't you cry. Tura lura lura, tura lura lie. Tura lura lura, it's an Irish
Oh no, without the booze, these guys all remember how much they hate each other.
This was such a pleasant St. Patrick's Day till the Irish people showed up.
And this is the second clip here.
Police have fired tear gas and plastic bullets at Catholic youths during rioting in Belfast, Northern Ireland. Some of the rioters threw stones and petrol bombs at the police, who also responded with water cannons. The clashes erupted when a Protestant parade passed through their estate in Ardoyne, northern Belfast. The marches are held every year by the Orange Order to mark King William of Orange's victory over Roman Catholic King James in the Battle of Boyne in 1690. But a 1998 peace deal and a 2007 agreement on power sharing has failed to prevent tribal clashes over marching rights. Last year's parade in the same area cost nearly €500,000 to police.
So the problem for me, at least when I was growing up, is that I grew up in an atmosphere where there was this sectarian violence. And as I say, Glasgow as a city was like a microcosm of Northern Ireland, with Catholics on one side and Protestants on the other. And the divisions were very real. I went to a Protestant school, and I remember when I was about 13, I was going in for my physics class, and the teacher hadn't arrived yet, or maybe he was staying out of the classroom for some reason, because we were due to go up and fight the Catholics that day in their school. And I remember standing up and saying, why are you guys doing this? You know, and I tried to explain the history of 1690 and how King William of Orange, the so-called Protestant savior, was actually funded by the Pope, who was engaged in an intrigue with King Louis XVIII of France. It was all about European power politics. It had nothing to do with Ireland. It had nothing to do with that. When these guys heard that I was saying that their hero, King Billy, King William of Orange in 1690, was actually hand in hand with the Pope, someone they regarded as the Antichrist, or had been told by their parents that this was the Antichrist, I ended up in a pool of blood on the floor. And I was lying there looking up at the ceiling thinking, oh, I could maybe do my PhD on this in about 14 years' time. But that's where the genesis of things comes from. It comes from something personal. It comes from your background. And you have to find a passion in that. I wanted to find out, why does this go on? Why do people still believe these myths? How can we change this? What is it in people's political behavior that causes them to act like this? Or why do they actually believe this thing? And it's basically lack of education. It's ignorance, it's prejudice, it's brainwashing, and these continue. I see 2011, the marches are still going on. They're going on in Northern Ireland. They're going on in Glasgow. A couple of years ago, I couldn't get across the street in Glasgow because of the Orange Parade. And it just provokes animosity, it just provokes hostility, it provokes violence. So I wanted to find out, to some extent, when I did my research for my PhD, why were people in Northern Ireland interested in protesting in the 1960s? What was some of the roots of the problem most recently? Why were Northern Irish Catholics, for instance, protesting against discrimination? Because they had economic, social, and political discrimination against them for about 50 or 60 years, ever since the founding of Northern Ireland in 1922. And that, to me, was what was driving my research. Why are people behaving in this way? Bernard mentioned that someone was talking about a social movement. Well, the Northern Irish Civil Rights Association was a sort of Catholic social movement to try and right these problems before it sort of got hijacked along the way by the IRA, the Irish Republican Army, and turned into another level of political violence. 3,500 people killed in Northern Ireland. Now, remember this, Northern Ireland is part of the United Kingdom, right? This is supposed to be a first world country, and yet the levels of ethnic and political strife and violence, political violence, seem to more reflect a developing country which is undergoing a lot of conflict. So one of the things I wanted to do was try to explain these conflicts, try to explain why people were protesting. And that's how I came to do my sort of PhD, and why these people were actually behaving in this. And I had sort of two theories that I was very interested in. One was relative deprivation. Relative deprivation sort of explains why individuals protest. They don't protest because they feel absolutely deprived. And this was developed by a political scientist called Ted Robert Gurr in the United States. I mean, the theory of relative deprivation is quite old, but he developed it into political science to explain political violence. So individuals protest because they don't feel absolutely deprived, but because they feel relatively deprived. And then I wanted to see, I said can't be the entire explanation why Catholics went out and protested. I wanted to use another theory called resource mobilization, which was started up by a sociologist called Charles Tilley. And what I wanted to do, that theory explains how groups mobilize. Where do they get their resources from? How do they use those resources? And I wanted to basically marry these two theories into kind of one theoretical construct or one practical application that would try to explain how the social movement, the Northern Irish Civil Rights Association, started, how it got going, and what its aims were, etc. So these were the things I was interested in. And I think also I wanted to develop a dynamic explanation. I wanted to find out what was the relationship between one type of theory, a theory that said this is how, or this is why individuals participate, and another theory of how do they mobilize their resources in that sense. So I wanted to go and discuss this. This turned out to be my PhD, my permanent head damage, which was eventually successful in some ways. But after I'd finished the PhD, after I'd got that out of the way, of course, you have to sort of try and continue with your research. And the first job I got after I did my research was, or after I did my PhD, was in Singapore. And I was teaching European politics in Singapore because that's what they basically hired me to teach, and because I had an expertise in British politics and Western European politics. But one day one of my colleagues came up to me and said, well, Ken, he said, you do all this stuff on European politics, but you're living in Southeast Asia. And he said, why don't you write something on Southeast Asia? Now, this was Singapore back in the 1990s. It was quite a conservative place. And I thought, well, what is it that I'm interested in Southeast Asia and Singapore? Where would my research interest take me? And the one thing, of course, I was interested in was human rights. And this was not a good idea at the time in Singapore. They spent a lot of time trying to convince me not to research human rights, but eventually I kept on doing it and produced a book on it. But I could not produce that research, or I could not get that research published until I was on the plane out of Singapore towards South Africa and my next job. So what I'm trying to say is research might be difficult in the sort of political context you find yourself in, but you have to persevere. You have to try to keep going, keep moving with your research, and stay passionate and connected. The other thing I think that's important is you have to have empathy. It's not just a position of saying, well, you know, you feel this research is important. You have to feel some sort of empathy with your subjects in that sense, or the people you're describing, or what you're doing. And in Northern Ireland, in Glasgow, that's how I came to feel that sort of empathy. It's all about identity to some extent. Those identities are very important, and they change over time, of course. And I remember when I was in Northern Ireland, the old joke was about the East Indian man that's walking down the street in Belfast, and someone goes up to him, a Protestant or Catholic paramilitary goes up to him and says, are you a Catholic or a Protestant? And he says, well, I'm neither, I'm a Hindu. And they say, yes, but are you a Protestant Hindu or a Catholic Hindu? So to some extent, it's about identity. It's about who you are. And I think that research shows that it shows it's part of your identity. It shows it's part of you. And that's what's important to me. Education in that sense for me was about taking these sort of myths apart, what explains things, and how to carry on with that. And all my research, I think, is there's some sort of continuity from civil rights to human rights, from Singapore to South Africa, from the war on terrorism to the politics of identity in the Middle East. I find that you have to make connections. You have to be really interested. I mean, I know this sounds obvious, but what's the point in writing about something or doing research on something you're not interested in? You have to really look at what you're interested in, what gives you meaning, and what forms part of your identity. And that way you'll do the best research. I don't know how much more I can say about that than it does seem obvious to me. It may not seem obvious to everyone, but you really have to find something that makes you passionate. that grips you in that sense about research. And I think that's the most important thing. At the end of the day, I'm program head for human security. I believe that human security is underpinned by human rights. And in all my writing and all my research, there is a sort of connection to human rights and what human rights are about, and preserving dignity of individuals and groups. And I believe that's very important. So I would say, if you're going to stay the course, you're going to complete your doctorate and avoid the permanent head damage, which might be inevitable in some ways. Find a research project that's personal, or one that you have a strong personal attachment to. I mean, it doesn't have to come from your childhood. It can come from, you may get very passionate about the environment, for instance. You know, Royal Roads is very interested in environmental sustainability. You may care about the way the environment's treated. That might be the focus of your research, and finding a topic within that. So I would say one that makes you passionate and makes you care, one that's going to get you up out of bed in the morning to do the research and try and understand what it is you're trying to explain. That's really important. I would say the key words are interest, commitment, empathy, focus, patience, and a strong sense of humor. Because there'll be days when you think, well, this is all wrong. You have to have a sense of humor and you have to carry on. There's no doubt about it. You have to have a need to know, and something that provides you with meaning in your life, continuity. So to some extent, and this is why I say it's very difficult to talk about what drives people to do research. It's a very individual thing. And if you can find that individual thing within yourself that makes you want to do that research, and then continue on with that provide some sort of continuity, that is really, really important. That's about all I've got to say, because I don't think there's anything more I can add to that.
Thanks, Ken. You'll entertain questions? Ken?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. So the floor is open for questions.
There is one thing I would say, that Royal Roads is a very practical bent. It's always talking about the practical application of things. Well, I completely agree with that. You know, I think probably research should have a practical application. But it's not to say that we know when we're doing the research what kind of practical application it will have. So you shouldn't be concentrating totally on, what is going to be the outcome of this in practical terms. Even if you integrate two theories and try to explain something, you're not going to know the consequences of that maybe for 10 years down the line, 20 years down the line, if ever. All sorts of things have practical applications, right? But it's not to say that you can see that immediately. So don't be worried about diving into research which says, well, you know, I've got to know that this is going to happen in 3 years' time, that this is going to change something. It doesn't work that way. It could change something in 50 years, in 100 years. Someone could pick it up and read it and go with it and change a policy or make a difference. It's not important to continually have this in the back of your mind about a practical application. That's something I think I would stress. I know some people would probably disagree with me on that, but that's okay.
So if I can raise something, Holly, go ahead.
Just wanted to ask you whether your follow-up work from your PhD actually found you, or did you have to actively seek it out?
The follow-up work, do you mean in terms of...
When you ended up in Singapore, for example.
All right. Well, I always had it in the back of my head. I mean, I always kept an interest in Northern Ireland, but I mean, you do move on. You start living in a different country, like Singapore. The Singaporeans weren't that interested in Northern Ireland to some extent. So you're influenced by the environment that you find yourself in also. So I was teaching courses on European politics, for instance. But then I thought, where's the connection between what I've been doing on sort of civil rights? Civil rights are the rights you have as a member of a nation state, whereas human rights are universal in that sense. Where's the connection? And I thought, well, if I could make the connection with civil rights and then go one more level up to human rights, then that would be the way I wanted to go. That's where I would find a research interest. So I started to write about human rights in Singapore, which was a little bit difficult. I remember I had a dean, and the Dean of Arts and Social Sciences. He was a guy called Edwin Thumbu, and he had a secretary who was calling me. I was supposed to present this paper on human rights at a conference, and his secretary would call me every week and said, "Is the paper finished?" And I'll say, "No, I haven't written it." You know, like most academics, they write their papers almost at the last minute. They're always tinkering around with something, like students. Right? You know, and I said, "No, I haven't finished it." Why? "Oh, we just really we're really interested." "Why are you so interested in my paper?" I never had a dean ask me for a paper before, you know. And they want to see what's in this paper on human rights in Southeast Asia. It was a very sensitive issue for them. You know, Singapore was a very conservative place. They really did not have a human rights agenda. It was a one-party state in that sense. And so eventually I did give them a paper, but it was highly sanitized. And then when I was on the plane, I put the paper back in, put it back together again. But it was a problem. I mean, I've seen all sorts of colleagues in Singapore, they were doing research. I had one colleague who was fired from the university because he actually stood in an election against the person who was going to be the Prime Minister in Singapore. He was fired from his job. They made a sort of case against him, you know, a political case, and it was, you know, almost like a Stalinist showcase, you know, without the execution. But there was lots of problems. There's politics involved, you know, what you can do and what you can't do when you go and live in places like Singapore. Also Dubai, for instance. I lived in Dubai for 7 years, and there was problems with what you could write. You couldn't really start doing research into the ruling family in that sense, you know. Although I will say, when I lived in Dubai, there was a lot of applications that were very, I mean, people in the monarchy in Dubai is very proactive. I was teaching a class on global studies, and I had written 2 words on the board. One was parochialism, and the other was cosmopolitanism, and I had sort of juxtaposed them against each other. Parochialism versus cosmopolitanism. And suddenly, the door flew open, and an entire entourage of people walked into my classroom, right, just like that, all in their robes, and I was given no warning, and it was what was it, the Sheikh, what's his, Sheikh Mohammed, the Crown Prince of Dubai, probably the richest man in the world. And he came in with his entourage, and all my students were all females. They were all in their abayas, their traditional costume. They all started wrapping themselves up immediately, because he was the king, right? He was the king of Dubai, basically, coming into the classroom, and they were showing their respect by wrapping themselves up. I didn't even know who the guy was, you know, I'd seen his picture, but I was like, suddenly the king's in front of you, you know, you can imagine the Queen walks in your room with no announcement whatsoever. And we were still sort of building the university, or they were not building the university, but they were, part of the university was not totally complete. So there was not a full frame around the board. And he looked at the board and he looked what I'd written on it, and then he turned around he didn't even say, "Who are you?" or it's just he says, "Where's the frame?" And I looked at him and I said, I don't know. I just work here, you know. I don't build a frame around the whiteboard, you know. And well, I never said that to him, of course. So, yeah, I get down on one knee and say, "Thank you, sire," you know. But and of course, he's an army of people behind him scribbling stuff. And then they all marched out onto the next place, and then into their helicopters and zoomed off into the desert. The next day, I went into the classroom, and there was a frame around that board, like that. You know, so that was real practical application. You know, I don't care about what you've written on the board. I care about that frame around the board. You know, I care that I have the tallest building in the world. These are important to some people.
Ken, I'm going to ask it then Wendy can ask it. I want to ask a question on behalf of the globalization class, actually. This is why I get priority. We were talking about international research, and the question was raised about how do you make and sustain the connections you need to do large-scale international projects when you're first starting out?
Yeah, very difficult. I mean, it takes a huge amount of work to try and make those connections in the first place, and then to try and sustain them, you know, because one of the arts, of course, of research is writing research grants and trying to get money and trying to get funding. It's an enormous task. So I would say, how do you mean, Bernard? Can you give me a sort of...
Where do you meet the people that you work with the rest of your life in the international arena? It's easy here, but...
Mm-hmm. Well, it's very difficult in terms of. I've always tried to sustain relationships with people, tried to work with them over the years, but again, academics are very individualistic kind of people, and it's very hard to get them to act on the same level that you think you're acting on, you know. For instance, next week I'm co-directing a workshop in Italy, and the workshop is basically on ethnic identities and state formation in the Middle East and North Africa. Now, this is a huge topic, and I'm trying at the moment to get a book series out of this, not only the workshop, but out of a proposal that I've submitted to a publisher in the UK. And I'm hoping that this book series will be in the range of something like 15 to 20 books, perhaps, right? But I have a co-director who lives in Dubai, works in Dubai, and he has all sorts of other stuff going on, all sorts of other agendas. I have to constantly remind them to do the work. It's extremely difficult. You know, I always say is all you can do when you're doing that is persevere.
Still, you put in conferences as a vehicle for starting and maintaining those connections.
Well, absolutely, but you know, I've been going to conferences for 25 years, 30 years, presenting papers. You make connections, you keep up those connections for a little while, then you lose that connection. You know, when you travel all over, you have to be very specific about the kinds of sections that you join within conferences and within workshops. But you have to make the personal connection, definitely. Otherwise, there are so many people doing so much of this kind of research that really forming these networks is really extremely important. But it's very difficult, I would say, to form a successful network because there's so many of them. You know?
Well, my question's a little bit like that, but at the other end when you're doing your PhD, Ken, because I think you've correctly identified that it is personal and often it arises out of something you don't like and you want to address. And then there's the writing in which you are the loneliest person in the world. But you also direct a master's program in which you have a cohort. I direct a master's program in which there is no residency cohort. So I want to ask you about what you thought about the importance of the cohort for this group, for any group that's, academically.
I think in terms of this group and the doctorate in social sciences, it's the most important factor. I know that in the master's program that I direct in human security and peace building, I hope that these people will keep the networks that they form, keep the connections all of their life, because I think it's very lucky, because when I was doing my PhD, you were sort of thrown in, but you had other PhD students, but there was an enormous level of competition amongst the students. You're all trying to get the same kind of money, you're all trying to get your PhD completed before the next person, you're trying to come up with better ideas. There's all this competition that goes on amongst PhD students. I would say if you can avoid that, if you can work with each other, if you can bounce ideas off each other, work as a network, keep that network the rest of your lives, because that'll be more important after the PhD than anything else, probably, in terms of your career. Maybe not in terms of your research, but certainly in terms of your career. That'll be incredibly important. I would say that's the most fantastic thing. I mean, I think that the model at Raw Roads is really important. I know that my students do incredible things. The students I have go all over the world. They're in Uganda, they're in Nepal, they're in South America, they're in Asia. They're all, I call my program the program to save the world, they're all trying to save the world. At least they come into that and then they find out they can't really save the world, but they carry on trying, right? Which is good. But the networks that they create and the friendships that they make and the bonds that they create will last them throughout their lives. And that's really inspiring, that's really motivational, because they can see what each other is doing, through their networks, through Facebook, through their emails, etc. They can see what they're doing in their lives, and they're doing some amazing things, and that inspires them, of course, to go on and do even greater things. And if you take a look at the board and the LIC, I think it's on the second level. There's a board with at least 3 of my students and some of the things they've been doing all over the world. Because the human security students, there's not many of them. I mean, we're not a huge program, but they get some of the highest profile in the university because they're really going out there and trying to change things. They're students who really believe that they can make a difference. Now that can sound naive, it can sound, you can be cynical about that, but at the end of the day, that's a really motivational thing. And you need that motivation when you're doing your doctorate or your PhD. You need to keep on thinking, why am I doing this? Why is it important? And what's it going to mean? Is it going to change something? You may not know what the change is, but you have to know that that's important. It's not I think the problem is that you get into doing a degree or a PhD or a doctorate, and at the end of the day, it does seem like a chore. It seems like, well, you're just jumping through the hoops, as we say, and you've got to keep on reminding yourself, why am I jumping through those hoops? That's really important. I think that's what's going to push you to finish it and then go on. And that's not the end, of course, that's just the beginning. Then you go on to permanent head damage. Never ending head damage.
Thanks.
Yeah.
First, Ken, I'd like to propose that perhaps the king was asking about the theoretical frame for the jumpsuit.
I wish he was. I wish he'd just given me the check there and then and said, "Well, thanks for that."
But I'd like to challenge a little bit the idea that research isn't necessarily practical or shouldn't be driven by practical expectations or understanding. I suppose if you're somebody like Stephen Hawking and you're able to imagine the workings of the cosmos, I'm all for letting people like that go ahead with their curiosity-driven research. But I think university society expects something, and we have a certain responsibility to deliver value for the money that we get paid to do the work that we do and the grants that support the research. Not necessarily, I think, research has to be immediately usable, but it should be useful, it should be relevant. And I guess my question is, how did you take your ideas, which were relevant, the issues that you were working on were very relevant, and how do you convert your learning into something that has practical application and make it available so that it does get used?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that's a really good question, but I also think that what's important is that you're generating knowledge, and that knowledge, the answers to some sort of problem that you're seeking, can be used by other people in terms of how they generate it. So if I send my book or my articles to a policy maker, for instance, then they're going to take it. It's very difficult I mean, I'm a political scientist by training, so it's very difficult for me to impose the kind of answers or solutions I would want on society. I can only hope that someone else might read that and say, well, I can see how that could make a change or that could make a difference, and I'll incorporate it into some practical application. But it also raises the questions of what is relevant, you know, what is relevant in research, what is important, what is practical. And I think you hit on the point, we can't immediately know the practical application of something. You know, it might come much further down the line, and it's hard to tell. I had a student, and I did my PhD in Florida State University, and I had a student who wrote to me about, this was back in the 80s, I had a student who wrote to me about 3 years ago, and he said, I really, really enjoyed some of your classes and what you were saying, and I wanted to ask you some more questions. I thought, well, this guy's writing to me about 25 years after the fact. So I said, that's interesting, you know, because I was teaching comparative politics, international relations, human rights, things like that. And I said to him, so what are you doing now? What's your career pattern now? He says, well, I'm a stockbroker at a top financial firm in New York. And I thought, wow. I mean, it's like, you know, something I had said to him, I don't know, maybe he went on to build a career out of that. It's difficult to know. What I'm saying is it's very difficult to know where that's going to go. You know, I agree with you that there's a lot of stuff at Raw Roads. Well, people want value for money. I don't know what that means actually when it comes down to what does it mean to say that this has got to have practical application when we don't really know. You say like people like Stephen Hawking, right? Well, maybe Stephen Hawking's ideas have practical application, but we just don't know how to work them out. But that's the whole point of research, you know, it's the whole point of trying to find out the answer to a problem or see where that's going. You see what I mean? Well, I mean, you know, it's like when Einstein came up with his theory of relativity, you know, who knew what that meant? Who knew what the practical application of that would mean? You know, I've got friends that are nuclear physicists and, you know, biochemists, and they talk to me about their work. I cannot even begin to comprehend it. It's just so complex and scientific and problematic for me because my brain just doesn't function like that. And they talk about this, and I say, well, what's the practical application of that? And even they can't explain the practical application of that, you know? So, you know, I mean, does that mean to say we shouldn't do the research? Or we shouldn't try to find out that? That's my problem with where that's going. If you just say, this is a problem, we've got to solve it, you know, or if you say, well, there's something, there's a piece of knowledge, or there's something we really don't know about, we have to do the research on it, but, you know, we have no idea where the practical application could be. It's very, quite difficult to. I know we're in disagreement over this, so, so maybe I'll shut up.
I was picking up the theme of the politics of research, and it reminds me of an article by I forget the author's name. It's called Iron in Ireland. Iron in Ireland. The problem was she did this wonderful research of a village in Ireland and looked at social issues, and then she returned after 6 or 7 years. She had lived there for about a year, and no one really wanted to speak to her because she had since published and basically revealed all the dark and dirty secrets of this little Irish town. And you were speaking about how you had to essentially wait till you left Singapore, and I can appreciate that, having lived in Southeast Asia too. You leave and then you reveal the truth.
Well,
and just going being more frank, I guess.
yeah.
And I'm just wondering if maybe for the students that are getting into research, that challenge of working in a local setting, exploring issues, trying to build a network, yet trying to be truthful in the research, because ultimately it may upset a few people when you come around to publishing. Is there a theme that you want to speak to, particularly in your line of work, being a piece of conflict?
Well, I think it's very difficult, and I've got a student, for instance, in Uganda right now. Actually, I just got an email from her this morning saying she'd been mugged and all her possessions had been stolen. And she works in another program called MACAM, the Masters in Conflict Analysis and Management. And what she wants to do is research on, as you know, Uganda's had a lot of conflict and strife in its history. And we have quite a few students down there that are working in these sort of post-conflict areas. She wants to do research on male victims of sexually gender-based violence in Uganda. Well, if you know anything about sort of Uganda, there's this very sort of anti-homosexual phobia. These sexual violence is very sensitive as a topic. So there's all sorts of issues around the organisation she wants to work with, and whether they will allow her access to data, etc. So we have to be careful in those kinds of environments as well. And I think there are all sorts of problems. I mean, that research is political. It involves a political context. It involves dealing with organisations that have vested interests or agendas already within that. It's not just going in and seeing if you pick up the data and then analyse it and churn it out and say this is what happens. You have to be very careful in these contexts. I mean, I remember when I lived in South Africa, I wrote a book on the South African Truth Commission, which was quite a sensitive topic. There was a commission set up after the end of apartheid to uncover the human rights abuses and find out the truth. Well, the truth for some people is very relative. For a lot of white people in South Africa, apartheid did not have all the human rights abuses that the new government, the ANC, were now saying. So there was different versions of the truth. And it was all very, very sensitive, of course, the access to data, who had done what to what, etc. It was highly problematic. But, trying to be as objective as possible, that's important, of course. But difficult.
Yeah.
I know that people have to get back to class, so Ken, on behalf of all of us here, thanks for sharing your thoughts.